My mother raised a glass of expensive Merlot, scanned the room full of guests at the Monarch, and beaming with a practiced sort of pride, delivered a toast to my sister Lauren, calling her the family's only hope and the bravest person she knew. A minute later, the waiter silently placed a leather folder in front of me with a bill for $3,450. In that moment I realized that to my family, I wasn't a daughter or a sister, but just an unlimited ATM obligated to fund other people's ambitions and grand gestures. My mother leaned into my ear, the scent of wine heavy on her breath, and whispered that teacher salaries are stable, so I should support my sister on her night of triumph, as it was the least I could do. I stared at her manicured hand resting on my shoulder, feeling something inside me finally snap and turn into a cold, sharp resolve. In this upscale establishment, smelling of truffle oil and old money, Lauren was celebrating her brand launch. A 2-page spread in a local lifestyle magazine that she insisted was going to put her on the map. The room was filled with minor investors, bloggers, and friends of friends, all clapping as my mother rambled about Lauren's genius while I sat there with that bill in my hands. My parents had always viewed my money as a communal resource because I was the reliable and grounded one, while Lauren was the creative soul who needed constant nurturing. This entire month had devolved into an endless marathon of demands and manipulations, starting with Lauren forgetting to pay her studio rent and ending with this lavish banquet. I looked at the numbers on the check and realized this amount was almost my entire savings for the vacation my fiancé, Jacob, and I had been planning for a year. Jacob sat beside me, and I could see his jaw tighten with barely suppressed rage as he realized what was happening. A heavy silence fell over the room when I didn't reach for my card. Instead, I closed the folder and slowly, with my fingertips, slid it back across the table toward my mother. There was a sharp clink as the edge of the leather folder hit the stem of her crystal wine glass, a sound that rang out like a gunshot in the hushed room. My mother froze, her face, which a second ago had been glowing with a smile, turning into a mask of shock and indignation, while Lauren looked around at the guests in a panic, checking to see if anyone had witnessed this act of defiance. I stood up, feeling a strange lightness in my legs, and in a calm, clear voice that carried to the back of the room, I said that if this was a brand launch, then the brand should pay for it. I didn't wait for a response, and I didn't stay to listen to my mother's hissed command to sit back down. I simply turned and walked toward the exit, feeling dozens of bewildered eyes on my back. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time all evening, I could take a full breath, knowing that this was only the beginning of a major war. In the car, Jacob and I were silent, but it wasn't the suffocating silence I was used to at home. It was the quiet before a storm that I had personally summoned. I expected to be hit by the familiar wave of guilt or the urge to go back and apologize, but instead I felt a frightening sense of clarity. The game was over. When we got home, I threw off my coat and looked at my phone, which was already vibrating with endless notifications from the family group chat. This was the first day of my personal uprising, and I knew that over the course of this month, I would have to dismantle everything built over the years just to remain myself. My family was used to me being the safety net stretched tight beneath their risky and foolish decisions, but tonight I had removed that net. I opened my laptop and created a blank Excel file, deciding that if they wanted to talk about debts and obligations, we would speak the language of numbers, not emotions. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, realizing that over the last 5 years, I had invested more in these people than in my own future. Every urgent matter, every one of Lauren's crises, and every bad month my father had was paid for out of my pocket under the guise of family solidarity. But the bill at the restaurant was the final straw, and now I was ready to send them a return invoice for everything. The next morning, the silence of my apartment felt like a heavy shroud, but my phone was a war zone. I didn't even have to open the messages to know the narrative they were weaving. I was the bitter, jealous older sister who tried to ruin Lauren's big night over a small misunderstanding about money. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours, ignoring the frantic vibration of my device, and focused entirely on the spreadsheet I had started the night before. I titled it The Henderson Audit, and as I pulled up my bank statements from the last 5 years, the sheer scale of my own stupidity began to take shape in cold, hard rows of data. It wasn't just the big things like the $5,000 I'd shelled out for my father David's DUI lawyer 3 years ago to keep him from losing his license and his dignity. It was the insidious, constant erosion of my finances, the emergency car repairs for Lauren that happened every few months, the utility bills for my parents' house that I covered once and then somehow became responsible for permanently, and the countless grocery deliveries I ordered for them because they were tight this week. I watched the total climb past 20,000, then 30,000, my heart hammering against my ribs with every new entry. I realized that while I was living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment and driving a 7-year-old sedan, I had been subsidizing a lifestyle for them that I couldn't even afford for myself. Jacob came into the kitchen and placed a hand on my shoulder, looking at the screen with a grim expression, and I saw the moment he realized just how much our future together had been delayed by my inability to say no. He didn't say, "I told you so," even though he'd been warning me for 2 years that they were draining me dry. He just squeezed my shoulder and started making coffee. Around noon, my mother Susan called for the 10th time, and this time I picked up, my voice flat and devoid of the usual apologetic tremor. She didn't ask how I was or if I had reached home safely. She immediately launched into a tirade about how Lauren had spent the night in tears, and how the investors were confused by my public display of hostility. She spoke about family values and the sacrifices she and my father had made, using the same tired script she had used since I got my first paycheck after college. I let her talk for 5 minutes, listening to the rhythmic cadence of her manipulation, and then I asked her a single question. "Mom, do you know how much money I've given you and Dad since 2020? The silence on the other end was absolute, as if I had suddenly switched the conversation to a language she didn't speak. She eventually stammered that families don't keep score and that I was being calculating and unbecoming, but I could hear the underlying note of panic in her voice. She knew the bank was beginning to question its interest rates. I told her I would be coming over on Sunday to settle the accounts, and before she could protest or demand an apology, I hung up. The rest of the week was a blur of tension and discovery, as I dug deeper into my records and found things I had suppressed or forgotten. I found a transfer for $800 to my mother for a medical procedure that I now realized, looking at her social media from that time, was actually a weekend spa retreat in Sedona. I found a series of payments to Lauren's credit card company that she had promised were one-offs, but had spanned an entire year. Every line on that spreadsheet was a memory of a time I had chosen their comfort over my own peace of mind, and the anger was starting to replace the lingering traces of guilt. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, uncovering a massive fraud where I was both the victim and the unwitting accomplice. By Friday, the Henderson audit was a 10-page document of betrayal, and the total was staggering $42,350. That was a down payment on the house Jacob and I wanted. That was the freedom to quit the teaching job I was starting to burn out on and start my own tutoring business. I hadn't just been helping my family, I had been liquidating my life to pay for their delusions of grandeur. I spent Friday evening with Jacob trying to breathe, but the air felt thin, like we were at a high altitude where every movement required extra effort. He told me he was proud of me, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew that when you stop being a source of income for people like my family, you stop being a person to them entirely. We sat on the balcony watching the city lights, and I realized that within a few days, I would likely be an outcast in the only family I had ever known. But as I looked at the total cell on my spreadsheet, glowing brightly in the darkroom, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a creditor. I wasn't going to that Sunday dinner to ask for permission to be independent. I was going there to serve notice. The month was only half over, and the facade of the perfect Henderson family was already cracking, revealing the ugly transactional rot underneath. I knew they were preparing their own defense, probably gathering at my parents' house to brainstorm ways to guilt-trip me back into submission, but they didn't know I had the receipts. Literally. The atmosphere in my parents' living room on Sunday afternoon was so thick with unspoken hostility that it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My father, David, was sitting in his usual wingback chair, looking like a judge about to pass sentence, while my mother, Susan, fluttered around with a teapot, though nobody was actually drinking tea. Lauren was perched on the edge of the sofa, her oversized designer sunglasses still perched on her head despite being indoors, her face a perfect mask of tragic victimhood. They didn't offer me a seat, and they didn't ask how my week was. They simply waited for me to stand in the center of the rug like a criminal in the docks. My father was the first to break the silence, his voice booming with that fake authoritative resonance he used whenever he wanted to hide the fact that he was in the wrong. He told me that my behavior at the restaurant was not just an insult to Lauren, but a direct attack on the family's honor, and that I had severely compromised her business prospects with my petty tantrum. I stood there, clutching the manila folder containing the Henderson audit, and realized that even now, after everything, they truly believed they were the ones who were owed something. My mother chimed in, her voice trembling with performative heartbreak, asking how I could be so cold-blooded about money when Lauren was finally on the verge of success. She actually had the nerve to say that as the older sister, it was my sacred duty to ensure Lauren didn't have to worry about the gritty details of life while she was building her brand. That was when I felt the last shred of my patience dissolve into a cold, hard knot of fury that settled deep in my stomach. I didn't raise my voice and I didn't cry. I just stepped forward and placed the folder on the coffee table with a deliberate, heavy thud that made the teacups rattle. I told them that if we were going to talk about duty and money, then we were going to do it with the lights on, and I started pulling out the spreadsheets, laying them across the table like a hand of cards. Their faces went through a fascinating transformation as they saw the headers: DUI legal fees, Sedona spa trip, Lauren's rent 2021 to 2023, parental utility arrears. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that precedes a massive explosion, as they realized I hadn't just been brooding, I had been documenting. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of purple, and he slapped his hand on the table, shouting that I had no right to spy on the family and that he hadn't raised a tax auditor. Lauren started to fake sob, wailing that I was trying to shame her for needing a little help, but I just kept laying out the papers, page after page of evidence of their collective parasitic behavior. The conflict escalated quickly when I pointed to the total at the bottom, $42,000, and told them that I was officially resigning from my position as the family's primary investor. My mother tried to pivot to a guilt trip, bringing up how they had paid for my braces when I was 12 and how they had allowed me to live at home for a year after college, as if a few $1,000s in childhood expenses somehow justified a lifetime of financial servitude. The air was filled with their accusations, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and disturbed, but I just looked at them and realized they weren't even seeing me as a human being anymore. I was just a malfunctioning piece of equipment that had stopped producing cash, and they were trying to beat it back into working order. Then the tension reached a breaking point when my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank, a notification I had set up just 2 days prior for any activity on my secondary account. I looked at the screen and felt my blood turn to ice. A pending charge of $1,500 from the same restaurant we had been at last Tuesday. I stared at my mother, who suddenly looked very interested in her fingernails, and I realized that she hadn't just been asking for an apology, she had already tried to steal from me again. I demanded to know what the charge was for, and for a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My father tried to bluster his way out of it, saying they needed to secure a venue for an upcoming event and they assumed I would want to contribute eventually anyway. The level of entitlement was so staggering that I actually felt dizzy, a physical reaction to the sheer audacity of their greed. This wasn't just a disagreement about a dinner bill anymore. This was a systematic attempt to strip me of everything I had worked for, and they were doing it with smiles on their faces. I felt a hard, sharp edge of desperation creeping into my voice as I told them that if that charge wasn't reversed in the next 10 minutes, I would call the police and report it as fraud. My mother let out a shrill, hysterical laugh, calling me insane and a traitor to my own blood, while Lauren looked on with a smug expression that told me she had been in on it the whole time. The conflict had moved past words and into a territory of pure, unadulterated war, and I knew that there was no coming back from this. I was standing in my childhood home, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me most, and I had never felt more like I was in a room full of enemies. The month was only 3 weeks in, and the world as I knew it was burning to the ground, but I wasn't going to be the only one who got scorched. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button, and looked my father in the eye, waiting to see who would blink first. The silence that followed my threat to call the police was different from the others. It was the silence of a predator realizing the cage door had finally been locked from the outside. My father's purple face faded to a sickly gray, and my mother's hysterical laughter died in her throat, leaving her looking small and withered on the expensive sofa I had helped her finance. I didn't back down. I stood there with my thumb hovering over the screen, counting the seconds of their hesitation while Lauren's smug expression slowly dissolved into a look of genuine panic. She was the one who broke first, turning to our mother and demanding to know why she had used my emergency card details that were still saved on the shared family account for the restaurant deposit. But the real blow came when my mother, cornered and desperate, blurted out that they didn't have a choice because the anniversary party was the only way to save the house. I froze, the phone still in my hand, as a completely different type of dread began to seep into the room. I asked her what she meant, and the story that tumbled out was a convoluted mess of bad investments, credit card kiting, and a second mortgage that my father had taken out to fund Lauren's lifestyle and his own failed business ventures. They hadn't just been using me for extra fun money. They had been using my contributions to keep a massive, crumbling structure of debt from collapsing on top of them for years. My father finally spoke, his voice no longer booming but cracked and thin, confessing that they were 3 months behind on payments and that the 30th anniversary party wasn't just a celebration. It was a networking event designed to lure in a silent partner David had been courting. They had pinned all their hopes on a lavish display of wealth to trick someone else into bailing them out, and they had expected me to fund the bait for their trap. The moral weight of the situation shifted in a way that made my head spin. If I stopped the payments and called the fraud department, I wasn't just refusing to buy Lauren a steak, I was essentially evicting my parents from their home. I looked at the spreadsheets on the table, the $42,000 of my life that had already disappeared into this black hole, and realized that no amount of money would ever be enough to fix the rot at the core of their lives. My mother began to wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated manipulation, begging me to think of the family, and promising that this would be the absolute last time they ever asked for anything. Then came the twist that I never saw coming, the one that made me feel like the floor had been pulled out from under my feet. Lauren, seeing that the poor victim act wasn't working on me, stood up and wiped her eyes with a cold, calculated precision that was terrifying to watch. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I didn't pay for the anniversary party and the mortgage arrears, she would tell Jacob's family about the settlement money I had received 3 years ago. I felt the air leave my lungs. 3 years ago, I had been involved in a minor legal dispute with a former employer over unpaid wages and a hostile work environment. It had been settled out of court with a strict non-disclosure agreement. I had never told Jacob the full details, only that I'd left the job on mutual terms, because I was ashamed of the situation and didn't want him to think I was trouble. My family knew because they had bullied the information out of me when they saw the extra money in my account. Money they immediately spent on a family vacation to Hawaii. Lauren was threatening to break my NDA and ruin my reputation with my future in-laws, portraying me as a litigious liar before I even walked down the aisle. I looked at my sister, the person I had protected and subsidized for my entire adult life, and realized she was willing to destroy my marriage and my career just to keep her own facade from slipping. The dilemma was agonizing. I could save my money and my soul, but lose my relationship and my reputation, or I could continue to be their slave and keep my secret safe in a gilded cage. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff with no good way down, and for the first time in this entire month, I felt a genuine paralyzing fear. I looked at the phone in my hand, then at the 3 people who shared my DNA but not my heart, and I realized that the Henderson audit wasn't just about money anymore, it was about survival. The tension in the room was so high that I could almost hear the molecules of oxygen snapping, and I knew that whatever I did in the next 60 seconds would change the trajectory of my life forever. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling as I looked at the call button, and then I looked at Lauren's triumphant, cruel smile. I realized then that she thought she had won, that she believed my fear of shame was greater than my desire for freedom. But she had forgotten one thing. I was the one who had spent 5 years learning how to live on nothing so that they could have everything. I had nothing left to lose because they had already taken it all, and that realization gave me a cold, terrifying kind of power. I didn't call the police, but I didn't put the phone away either. I opened the camera app and started recording. "Say that again, Lauren," I whispered, my voice as sharp as a razor. "Tell me exactly what you're going to tell Jacob's family." The color drained from her face as she realized that in her greed, she had just handed me the ultimate piece of evidence. The look on Lauren's face as I held up the phone to record her was the most honest expression I had seen in years. It was pure, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to backtrack, to spin another web of lies, But for the first time in my life, I didn't give her the space to breathe. I told her that if a single word of her twisted version of my past ever reached Jacob or his family, this video, along with the full Henderson audit, and the evidence of the fraudulent credit card charge, would be sent to every one of her brand investors and posted on every local community board. The room went silent, a final heavy silence that felt like the end of a long, exhausting war. My mother tried to reach for my arm, her eyes welling with real tears this time, but I stepped back, avoiding her touch as if it were toxic. I told them that the $1,500 charge would be reversed by the end of the hour, or I would walk straight to the precinct. I watched as my father, the man I once looked up to as a pillar of strength, slumped into his chair and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he navigated the banking app to undo his theft. There was no grand apology, no moment of family reconciliation, just the sound of a man defeated by his own greed. I gathered my spreadsheets, my evidence, and my dignity, and I walked out of that house without looking back, leaving the keys to their front door on the hallway table. When I got to the car, Jacob was waiting, and I didn't hide anything anymore. I told him everything: the settlement, the debt, the blackmail, and the rot. He didn't look at me with judgment. He looked at me with a profound sadness that I hadn't been able to trust him enough to tell him sooner. He took my hand and told me that we were going to be okay. But that okay didn't include them. The remaining week of the month was a blur of administrative finality. I changed my phone number, blocked their emails, and sat down with the lawyer to ensure that my financial ties to them were legally severed forever. I found out through a mutual cousin that the anniversary party was canceled and that the house was officially listed for sale. The facade had finally crumbled, and they were forced to face the reality they had been running from for a decade. It's been 3 months since that day in the living room, and the silence from my family is no longer a source of anxiety. It's a sanctuary. I realized that the $42,000 wasn't lost. It was the tuition I paid for a very expensive lesson in self-worth. I lost a mother, a father, and a sister, but in the wreckage of those relationships, I found the person I was always meant to be before I became their ATM. Jacob and I are planning a small, private wedding now, one that we can actually afford because my paycheck finally stays in my own bank account. I still have the video of Lauren on an old cloud drive, not because I want to use it, but as a reminder of the day I stopped being a victim and started being a witness to my own life. There's a specific kind of grief that comes with realizing your parents never really saw you as a person, only as a utility, but there is also a specific kind of freedom in finally closing the account. Sometimes I wonder if they've changed, if they've found a way to be honest now that the easy money is gone, but I don't check their social media and I don't ask around. I've learned that you can't fix people who see your boundaries as a personal insult, and your success as a communal bank. My life is much quieter now, and sometimes the apartment feels a little too empty, but then I remember the sound of that leather folder hitting the wine glass and the feeling of the cold night air on my face. I am finally in the black, not just financially but emotionally, and for the first time in my 34 years, I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop. I am the one who dropped it. The account is closed, the balance is zero, and the future is finally mine to spend however I choose.